Can't say for sure.
There we go. Right, sir, could you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm the testimony you give to be the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
And I'm going to swear you again when the jury, when you testify before the jury.
Do you have this?
Right now, I don't know if they explained it to you, we're just giving a preview of your testimony for me to make a ruling on whether certain aspects are missing.
Yes.
Okay?
And then I just want to keep it. I want to make sure you have. If you would, sir, please state your full name for the court, spell your last name for the court reporter.
Dennis Keith Waller, W-A-L-L-E-R.
And what is your profession or occupation?
Currently, I do consulting and sometimes expert witness testimony on police practices matters primarily related to police litigation.
And what is your both professional and educational background to allow you to testify in court?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Police Administration from Michigan State University. I have a master's degree in Public Administration from Florida International University. I was in law enforcement for, I think, about 16, 17 years. I served as a police officer, a detective, sergeant, lieutenant, department training officer, field training officer, SWAT team. I was chief in 2 different locations or jurisdictions. Also, I was a director of law enforcement training at a regional police training academy in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. I've also served as a police academy instructor in a variety of disciplines, including criminal investigation and the various aspects involved in that, death investigation, and even use of informants.
And where have you taught?
I've taught at Craven Community College, Wake Technical College, and at Craven Community College, I was the coordinator or department chair of the criminal justice program. At Wake Technical College, I was in the police, a police science instructor, also the director of law enforcement training. I taught for a couple of years at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, and one of my primary courses was criminal investigation. And I've taught as an adjunct instructor in probably 6 or 7 different colleges and universities, and in many of those it was criminal investigation. And when I taught criminal investigation, a big component of that is the use of informants.
In addition to teaching at the college level, have you taught law enforcement officers?
I have, and also as a detective, I was trained in utilizing informants and also actually used them. I was also, as chief of police in Ripon, Wisconsin, we were a member of a tri-county drug unit. I was on the board of that, and the board members approved the use of various informants for drug cases, and we also approved the different drug investigations that our investigators and undercover people were conducting.
When informants are used, did you have or are there any criteria for the use of informants?
Yes, I mean, you have to question an informant's motive and determine if they're reliable or not. I mean, before you can use an informant to gain a search warrant or an arrest warrant, you have to make a determination of their reliability. And informants who are aware of criminal matters generally do not come forth and just volunteer their information. They have a motive. they expect something in return. And you have to make a determination of what that is and if the information that they give you is reliable.
And is this true in using informants in courtroom settings as well?
Are you talking about jailhouse informants?
Yes, sir.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the state of Illinois did the Northwestern University College of Law did a study of wrongful convictions, and they determined that I think 46%, almost half, of the wrongful convictions were caused by a significant cause was the use or improper use of informants.
I don't have anything further.
Well,
We're on this, we're just talking about this particular issue. Obviously, when he testifies, I'm going to have numerous other questions.
I don't know if he's gone far enough for me to understand the totality of what his opinions can be if he has one.
Based upon that, do you have an opinion about the use of informants?
I do.
And what is that opinion?
Basically, they should be considered unreliable until they prove otherwise, and you determine their motivation.
Okay. Do you have an,
I have no question.
Sir?
Does the state have any Proffer?
No, sir.
Okay. State, you're objecting?
Your Honor, a witness cannot express an opinion regarding the credibility of another witness. Did you get all that, Madam Clerk? And I'm citing Callaway v. State, 210 Southern 3rd, 1160, quote, experts may not comment on the credibility of other witnesses. This is a question for the jury judge as to the credibility of Mr. Purefoy in this case. And this witness cannot give his opinion as to the credibility of Mr. Purefoy or any other witness for that matter. There's a jury instruction that is on point as to the credibility of witnesses, and it's read in every criminal case, and that's what the jury is to use to weigh that.
we didn't specifically direct it towards Mr. Purefoy. We talked about informants in general terms, and we did not comment on Mr. Purefoy's testimony. The only issues that Mr. Waller raised was to look at their motives and also the reliability of them. But we did not comment specifically on Mr. Purefoy's testimony.
Well, it seems to me it's going directly at it and saying in the class that informants are not to be believed. And that's obviously a jury question, and it's obviously something to be subject to fair argument in closing. Much less haven't heard anything about how these expert opinions were determined, that studies, what the data was, what went into it, whether it's ever been, he's been allowed to render such an opinion in a Florida court.
Do you have the study with you?
I do.
I don't want to study. Anybody can read a study. I would say what would be the data to support. I'm not asking him to say it, but besides there's a study that says it, I can run a study to tell you anything.
Well, you can do that with any expert witness, Your Honor.
Right, but we got a little different study now. But also this goes to a whole unique issue of credibility of a witness. You could, I mean, be like a witness coming in here and saying police officers are known to be unreliable and be untruthful. That would clearly be admissible. Or to come here and say people who are on trial are clearly untruthful. That's a jury question.
No, and this-
Motivation is plain and obvious and within the scope of each individual juror to weigh. I mean, the possible motives are out there. You examine it during cross-examination. But go ahead.
If I could, no, I'm not arguing with your ruling, but I'm going to lay out my record, Judge. Mr. Waller, could you refer to specifically that Northwestern Law School University report? When was it rendered?
The survey was conducted 2004, 2005.
And what was the name of the article?
The snitch system.
Well, I can guarantee you that name will never come into
Well,
because it's prejudicial and inappropriate for a court setting. But you could have, same thing with the defendants. On average, are defendant caught with drugs in their possession, will they be truthful about the nature of the possession? I mean, there'd never be a witness allowed to come in and say that, give an opinion. That's a jury question. The attorneys can argue the motives established by the fact. But anyway, I'm going to sustain the state's objection.
okay.
Rule that opinion,
As to that particular
that
issue.
particular opinion about the believability of the informant.
We would ask that that also apply to any mention of this law school report from 2004 to 2005.
I don't believe it would have any other purpose.
You mean the snitch system?
Yeah. Yes. So, all right, thank you. Is the jury ready? Okay, bring jury in, please. Please be seated. And Mr. Griffin, you may proceed.
Dr. Larson, please.
Good afternoon. Would you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm the testimony you give is the true self you got?
I do.
Thank you. Please be seated.
If you would, sir, please state your full name for the court and spell your last name for the court reporter.
Paul C. Larson, Larson.
And if you could, sir, please give us your educational background.
I have a PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Utah in 1977 and a Juris Doctor degree from DePaul University in 1993.
Okay. And in addition to that educational background, can you tell us what your profession has been?
In addition to that, I'm also an ordained minister in Circle Sanctuary, which is one of the nation's oldest Wiccan churches, chartered in the state of Wisconsin.
Okay. And have you been a professor or have you taught at the university or college level?
I have. I am currently retired, but I still hold rank as Professor Emeritus at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, where I taught for 22 years.
And what did you do at the Chicago? What was your teaching involved?
I was hired to teach health psychology because my clinical experience as a psychologist was mostly in working with medical cases and disabilities. But then I broadened and was able to teach most of the other courses in the curriculum, including the history of and philosophy of psychology, social psychology, cognitive psychology, and others.
Did you teach any religion courses?
Yes, we had for a brief time a concentration in psychology and spirituality, and I taught a course on psychology and spirituality for that.
And have you ever been in the Wicca religion? Are you prayer leaders, or what is the proper terminology?
I'm an ordained minister in Circle Sanctuary, which is a Wiccan church, and I have served for 10 years up until July of 2019 as the designated religious group leader at the Racine Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, which is an adult facility, and for 2.5 years at the Recruit Training Command at Great Lakes Naval Station.
So was that the United States Navy that had you there?
Yes, it was.
Now, can you explain to the jury what the Wicca religion is. Give them a little history and tell them what the Wicca religion is.
Yes. The short answer is that the Wiccan religion is a modern religious movement that takes its inspiration from the pre-Christian religions of the ancient world. It's part of what I call a very broad umbrella group that is known perhaps better as paganism, or some groups prefer the term heathen. But I think the best way of describing it is really how it is billed at Naval Station Great Lakes, which is earth-based spirituality. The common thread for not only Wicca, but Druidry and ceremonial magic and modern shamanism and several other groups that would fall under that umbrella is all taking nature to be divine. Rather than seeing nature as something created by a God outside of nature, we see the divine as within nature. The divine is the sun, the moon, the earth, the sky, the seas, the mountains. All of those things participate in the divine. And I think that would be a common belief in Wicca, in Druidry, in all of the other groups that would fall under that umbrella.
Would that fall under Native American religions as well?
They would be very similar. And in fact, in recent parliaments of the world's religions, there's been a significant movement of commonality between the various representatives of indigenous religions from around the world and the contemporary pagan religious group leaders from Europe and America.
Now, is this what you would call a polytheistic religion as opposed to a monolithic religion?
Or monotheistic.
Monotheistic,
Yes,
excuse me.
it is.
Can you explain that?
Again, beginning first with Zoroastrianism and then with Judaism, then Christianity, and then Islam, all of those religions are monotheistic. That is, they believe that there is only one God. Most of the religions of the ancient world and many of the indigenous religions of the world believe in many gods, and that's what we call polytheism. And again, the cultures may differ in the names that they call the gods. Perhaps the ancient Greek and Roman gods are more familiar, but also the Norse gods are also polytheistic, and the Celtic gods and Egyptian religion and Sumerian and Babylonian and so on.
Now, in this particular case, during an interview of my client by law enforcement, it has been alleged that because my client practiced Wicca, that he would have participated in a sacrifice of the deceased. Is there anything such as sacrificing either of animals or people in the Wicca religion?
No, there is not. There certainly was a tradition of both animal and human sacrifice in the ancient world, but one of the things that characterizes the modern religious world is that we have abandoned completely human sacrifice, and outside of a few smaller instances, most religions now have abandoned animal sacrifice as well.
Does the Wicca religion practice animal sacrifice?
No.
Now, Mr. Hartung in the interview described himself as being a sole practitioner of Wicca. What does that mean?
This is very common. Indeed, I would think most of the people who would identify as pagan or Wiccan or heathen or druid or similar sorts of spirituality, for a better part of their time would have been what's called solitary practitioners. And these are people who come in contact with the beliefs and the practices either through reading books or online, but don't participate in any social groups and don't join a coven or don't participate in any pagan festivals. They simply practice on their own.
Now, it was also suggested at the interview of my client that he murdered his family as a blue moon ritual. Can you tell me if there are any blue moon rituals or any history in the Wiccan religion of sacrifice on the blue moon?
No. We do honor the cycles of the moon, and so it is common for rituals to be performed on the full or the new moon, but they're not the major rituals of the religion.
What type of rituals might these be?
The lunar rituals?
Yes, sir.
They would be simply celebrating the fullness of the moon and the accomplishment of some major task or purpose that the person has been working on. Or if it's a new moon, then it would be used for the starting of a process of spiritual development or some sort of work toward a goal. So either the culmination during the full moon or the beginning of a process in the new moon would be the types of purposes for which rituals are conducted.
Does a blue moon itself, which is 2 full moons in 1 month, does that have any importance to the Wicca religion?
Not at all. I mean, not beyond the fact of its being a full moon, but the blue moon, because of its rarity, is no more important than any other full moon.
Is there in Wicca a belief in any type of violence?
No.
Is there a theory that what you give out is kind of what you get? What is?
Yes, that is called the law of return, and that's one of the basic ethical principles of the Wiccan religion, is that whatever you put out by way of energy or actions, whether it is good or bad, will come back to you in similar form.
Now, there was a photograph that was introduced by the state, which is Exhibit 360. And it is a picture of Mr. Hartung's, of a drawer in his home. And there is a book called, it's a blue covered book with a pentagram on the front of it called The Complete Book of Witchcraft by Raymond
Buckland.
Buckland.
Yes.
Couldn't read the last name on here. Can you tell the jury why a Wiccan would have a complete book of witchcraft?
Okay. To do so, I need to talk a little bit about the history of witchcraft. From the anthropological literature, there is no human culture that does not believe in witches and has not accused some people within their culture of witchcraft. And by that typically is meant the use of magic to cause harm to people or crops or bad weather or things like that. And certainly during, in Europe, during the 15th through 17th century, there was a witchcraft craze in which literally thousands of women and some men were killed, judicially murdered, having been accused and convicted of witchcraft. Then things calmed down after the mid-1700s, and a more rational approach to alternative spiritualities prevailed. And then it was in 1954 that an Englishman named Gerald Gardner wrote the book Witchcraft Today, in which he posited that the old sort of folk healers and those who studied herbal remedies and did moon rituals and things of that sort were really part of a much older ancient religion. And so he, in his book, set out a modern understanding of witchcraft as a nature-based, an earth-centered spirituality. And he coined the term Wicca for the public face of that. Up to that point, and what he was involved in was coven practice, which is a small group that is initiatic. That is, you have to be a member of that group, and you have to be to study before you are initiated into that group, and you are then told the secrets of that group. Modern paganism really begins in the 1970s when first in America and then throughout Western Europe, Wicca became a public religion. And this coincided with the environmental movement and the second wave feminist movement. So a lot of the early pagan leaders in the 1970s were people who were very strongly influenced by, again, a positive aspect to the environment and a positive aspect to the divinity of female energy. And so what happened was we now are in the phase of public festivals. Our church, Circle Sanctuary, for example, does at least 8 major rituals throughout the year. The 4 solar rituals of the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes, and then there are 4 what are called cross-quarter festivals that are spaced in between the solar festivals. And the largest one of those is the one that occurs during the summer solstice. And this is it's called Pagan Spirit Gathering, and it is in a campground for a week around the summer solstice, and there are anywhere from 800 to 1,100 people, including families and children, that camp out for that purpose. And so this represents this more public face of Wicca, where most of the participants who start out as solitary practitioners eventually do affiliate with these public groups, and some of them then go on to go through the traditional initiatic path and join a small group or a coven.
Now, does the Wiccan religion or the witchcraft of the Wiccan religion have anything to do with the witches that dress all in black with the pointed hats and give out poison apples to kids or anything like that?
No, that's a reflection of Europe in the 1600s, when again the pointed hat was a common element of dress. Also, the idea that witches rode broomsticks and the witches had black cats as familiars. All of this is cultural residue from European culture in the 1700s.
Now, I've shown you some photographs of the bodies in the Smith household that were murdered. Is there any indication that those bodies were placed in any way in a ritualistic manner?
Absolutely none. They were basically haphazardly placed or partially covered up. But this doesn't make any sense from a ritual standpoint. If you were to use a sacrificial victim for a religious purpose, you would want them to be displayed in some way that is surrounded with other ritual elements like incense holders, candles, pentagrams, or other sorts of things like that. And there was none of that at the Smith household. They were all pretty much, as I said, haphazardly arrayed according to the videotape I saw of the crime scene.
And it was also alleged in the interview that the covering of the bodies had something to do with the Wicca religion. Can you tell us about that?
That's not true. There's no aspect in which an offering or something that is used in a ritual would necessarily be covered. I mean, the whole thing is to expose it to the divine and to bear witness to the act. So why cover up something that you are doing for ritual purposes? It just doesn't make sense.
Would it be fair to say that the allegations that were directed to Mr. Hartung, as I've relayed them to you, are inaccurate?
Absolutely.
And that there's no basis in fact for those?
Yes.
Yes, I'm correct.
You are correct.
Thank
That is
you.
correct.
I like that.
Yes.
I don't have anything further.
Good afternoon.
Just a couple of questions. Did you review the link or the website that the law enforcement referred to?
I was given access through defense counsel to the discovery materials that were given to them.
Right. Did you review the website?
the website. Oh, the No Nonsense Ministries. Yes, I
Yes,
did.
sir. Okay, and I believe you said when we took your deposition that some of it was partially true and then some of it was, I think you said fantasy or something like that.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so some of it was partially true, but it was not entirely accurate, in your opinion.
It was significantly distorted.
Okay. Have you testified as to the Wiccan religion before?
No.
Now, when you were talking about rituals, and defense counsel asked you, did the body's placement have any sign of a ritual? And you said, no, absolutely not. Okay.
Yes, I said that.
If the Wiccans don't participate in human sacrifice, then what are you looking for? And what are you basing that opinion on?
Well, how anything would be placed in a ritual context, whether it would be even a live human being or an animal or fruit to be offered or other things to be offered to the divine. Again, the whole nature of ritual is deliberateness and selecting something and some words to say and some gestures and some actions to do that link the human with the divine. And there was nothing in the crime scene video that I saw that looked like that.
Yes, sir. You said earlier that the rituals of the Wiccan follow the solstices and moon patterns.
Solstices, equinoxes, and there are 4 festivals that fall halfway in between a solstice and an equinox. And those are known as the cross-quarter festivals.
You testified that the blue moon, the full moon, can you tell the jury just what that is? What's the blue moon?
Well, a blue moon technically is the second full moon in a month. And it's a fairly rare occurrence, occurring several times over several years. But I don't know, I would imagine there's probably 1 full moon a year at least, because there's 13 moons in a 12-month period. But again, there's no specific emphasis on the blue moon as opposed to any other full moon.
And so in the Wiccan religion, it would just be another full moon?
Another full moon, yes.
Now, my understanding of Wiccan is you said it's a broad umbrella and it encompasses a lot of different types, subsets, maybe?
Let me correct that. I would use the word pagan or heathen, or again, what the Naval Station Great Lakes actually called our group, which was earth-based spirituality. And I think that is actually much more accurate. Nature-based or earth-based religion. And under that broad umbrella, Wicca would be one of several different groups that fall under that umbrella.
Is witchcraft a part of Wicca?
Yes.
Is a Ouija board part of Wicca?
Not really. It is a divinatory tool that was much more common in late 19th century and first half of the 20th century in America. It's fallen out of favor. It's kind of like a typewriter compared with a computer. The tarot cards, the runes, and other devices are now much more common as oracular or divinatory tools, but the Ouija board is still one of them, an acceptable one. It's slightly dated.
Are ropes used in Wiccan rituals?
I beg your pardon?
Rope?
Rope?
Yes, sir.
It can be.
What about broom?
A broom?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
What about wands?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the term high priest in Wicca?
Yes.
What is that?
A high priest is one of 2 leaders in an initiatic group following Wicca or witchcraft. And I think Druidry also uses the term high priestess or high priest. And there usually are 2, a female known as a high priestess and a male known as a high priest.
Is the term witch, is that a female term?
It's mixed.
Okay. Is there a male term that's more appropriate?
Some people use the term wizard, other people use the term warlock.
I know we talked about, or Mr. Griffith asked you about Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft. You're familiar with that?
Yes,
And there's a book called the Book of Wicca. Are you familiar with that?
yes.
Willow Root Wands. Are you familiar with that?
Not very, but I've heard of it.
Witches and Tarot by Ellen Dugan.
Yes.
Tarot Made Easy by Nancy Guerin.
I know of it, but I don't use it.
What about sacredsource.com?
I beg your pardon?
Sacredsource.com?
That's a well-known source for statues and other ritual implements.
Are you familiar with the book The Solitary Practitioner?
Yes, by Scott Cunningham.
And in your study of religion and your experience as a college professor, animal sacrifices, you're familiar with those?
Yes.
Okay. And I believe in your deposition you talked about when maybe a rabbi's blessing food.
I'm not clear what you're getting at here.
You said when rabbi slaughters an animal for kosher meat.
Okay. For both the preparation of kosher meat and halal meat, which is the Islamic equivalent,
Right.
the animal's throat is cut.
For the blood to drain out?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, sir. Those are my questions. I'm sorry. For you testifying, what's your hourly rate?
I don't recall. I think it's around 400 an hour.
Okay. And for your preparation for trial?
I think that was 350.
And you know how many hours you got in?
I would have to look at my logbook.
Okay. So you were coming here today to testify, but you don't know how many hours you got in.
I know what I've logged. I don't have it in my memory, but I have it on my computer, and if I needed to, I could retrieve that information.
All right. At this point, when you gave your deposition, do you remember being asked that question?
Vaguely.
And I'm going to give you a figure, 5,950. Does that sound right?
Sounds good.
Thank you.
You regret?
Yes. When you were talking about kosher meats and halal meats, you weren't talking about doing Wiccan sacrifices, were you?
No, and that's not even considered a sacrifice in either Islam or Judaism. It is a means of meeting the dietary rules. And that's different from what used to be called a sacrifice in Judaism during the era of the Second Temple before its destruction. That's when animals were sacrificed routinely at the Second Temple. But since the destruction of the temple, there's no formal sacrifices in the sense of killing an animal solely for an offering to the divine. And that's different from killing an animal for food and following either Sharia or Halakha, that's Jewish dietary laws, in order to make it appropriate.
For meat to meet kosher standards, isn't there's a specific way the rabbi has to slaughter the animal, is
Yes.
that right?
Yes.
And that has to do with slitting its throat to drain
Yes.
the blood out?
Yes.
And a lot of that has to do with going back in time to the cleanliness of the meat, does it not?
It does.
And a lot of the dietary prohibitions on in the Jewish religion and in the Islamic religion has to do with the health and the storage of food back in ancient times.
It does.
So that has nothing to do with any kind of Wicca sacrifice.
Correct.
Now, Mr. Meyer asked you about your pay. You're being paid by the state of Florida through the Judicial Administration Commission, are you not?
I am.
And you submit your time records to them to be paid.
Yes.
Okay. And I'm not paying you directly. It's
No.
through- There are prayers in the Wicca religion, right?
There are.
And are they similar to prayers in the Christian religion or in Christianity?
Very similar in that they are addressed to a person or a force, sometimes an impersonal force, but they're oral or can be written.
And one of the main differences, the polytheism versus the monotheism, is that correct?
Correct.
And are there directions that are important in the Wicca religion? Points of the compass?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury about that?
It's very common as part of the opening of a ritual to do what's called calling the quarters, in which the officiant will usually face one direction and invite the spirits of that direction and the associated elements with that direction to come into the circle and be present during the ritual, and then go around and do that for all of the four cardinal directions, and at the end of the ritual to release those forces and thank them for their presence is also common.
And it's common, is it not, for practitioners of Wicca to have their own prayer room?
Yes.
And is that usually in your home?
Yes.
And what does that involve?
That's very personal, and it usually involves having some sort of representations of the divine, whether in the form of pictures or statues, as well as things like candles and what is called a wand, or there's a particular ritual dagger called an athame that is also very important in ritual, and all sorts of other ritual implements that might be used for specific purposes, incense, candles, things of that sort.
Now, Mr. Myers asked you about a website.
Yes.
He said part of it was true and part of it was fantasy.
Well, I wouldn't say fantasy, but it was distortion, and what it was aiming at was discrediting most religions. And I checked it just before coming down here today, and it advertises itself as an atheistic site. But it has material debunking not only Wicca, but Scientology and Druidry and all sorts of other religions, and has a variety of other accumulated materials, many of which, again, dealing with human sacrifice, are accurate for the ancient world, but the implication of it is that this is still going on now, which is inaccurate and is a distortion.
When you talk about the ancient world, what are you talking about?
The pre-Christian world, up until about 500 of the Common Era, when I think it was the Emperor Justinian closed down the pagan temples and made and forbade the practice of pagan religion.
You said that that website was an atheistic website?
On the very front page, it has that phrase, yes.
And does it also criticize the Christian religion?
I didn't see it there.
Any other religions beside the Wiccan religion?
Well, in
and the other?
Scientology, and I think there were a couple of other sidebars that had additional material.
I don't have anything further. Yeah, maybe I do. There is some sort of sacrifice in all religions, is there not?
There is.
And can you explain that to the jury?
A sacrifice in contemporary religions is giving up something of personal value either to the divine as an offering or as a part of a spiritual discipline to get closer to the divine. For example, in Christianity, we will soon be entering the season of Lent, which is a season which people are asked to sacrifice something in order to gain additional spiritual value.
So when we talk about sacrifice, we don't necessarily mean the sacrifice of a body or of a life. We can sacrifice by virtue of giving up alcohol, giving up red meat, et cetera, as we do in Lent.
Exactly, and also of offering to the altar things like food and grains and fruits and so on. The most common offerings are the fruits and vegetables and those sorts of things.
Thank you, sir.
Anything further from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. You can stay.
Thank you.
Can we check on that? Whoever can do that, you're speaking into
Do you want a former or does it matter?
May I get a check on the next witness, Your Honor?
Yes. Good afternoon, sir. Have a seat and I'll swear you in. You can raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm testimony you give will be the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
If you would, sir, please state your full name for the court and spell your last name for the court reporter.
Dennis Keith Waller, W-A-L-L-E-R.
Mr. Waller, can you give us a background of your education as well as your professional qualifications?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Police Administration from Michigan State University. I have a Master of Science in Public Administration from Florida International University. I have over 3,700 hours of law enforcement training, and I've served as both, I've served in a variety of law enforcement positions. I've taught at the college and university level, and I've also been actively involved in training law enforcement officers.
Have you ever been the chief of police of any police department in the United States?
Yes, I was chief of police in Ripon, Wisconsin. I was also the interim chief of police, campus police for the University of Wisconsin, Platteville, for about 5 or 6 months while they were selecting a new chief.
Have you ever been a police officer in the state of Florida?
I have.
And where was that?
Miami-Dade Metro Police Department and also South Miami Police Department.
And as far as your educational background is concerned, were you ever the coordinator of any criminal justice program?
I was. I was a coordinator or department chair of the criminal justice program at Craven Community College in New Bern, North Carolina.
Were you ever a director of law enforcement training for any college or university?
Yes.
Where was that?
After spending 2 years at Craven Community College, I transferred within the system to Wake Technical College in Raleigh. I was the director of law enforcement training there. Basically, I was in charge of a regional police training academy.
And have you ever been an adjunct lecturer or instructor to any universities or police agencies?
Yes.
Can you give us some of them?
University of North Florida, the Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina State University in Raleigh, Marion College or Marion University of Fond du Lac. There were probably 4 or 5 different technical colleges in Wisconsin where I've been a adjunct instructor.
Have you ever been an adjunct instructor for the Internal Revenue Service?
Yes, their, I think it was their internal investigative unit for the criminal investigation component for the IRS.
And are you a member of numerous professional associations?
I am and/or have been, yes.
How about for the American College of Forensic Examiners?
I was a member of that for 20 years. I was achieved the status of fellow for the American College of Forensic Examiners. There's a subunit within that, the American Board of Law Enforcement Experts, and I was a diplomate for that subunit.
And have you been involved in other professional associations for law enforcement agencies?
Yes, sir. I've been a member of the Wisconsin Chiefs of Police Association. I'm currently a member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, have been for 30-plus years. I've been involved with Law Enforcement Training Officers Association, the International Association of Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors, I believe I got that right, a variety of other law enforcement organizations that primarily deal with training issues.
Have you been a certified police instructor in any states?
Yes, sir.
And
In
can you tell
Michigan, I'm sorry,
Tell us which states those are.
Michigan, Florida, North Carolina, and Wisconsin.
And have you been a diplomat for the American Board of Law Enforcement Experts?
Yes. Not a diplomat, a diplomate. I've never
Diplomate,
been accused of being a diplomat.
Diplomate, excuse me, sir. You've got on your curriculum vitae that you're a civilian response to active shooter events instructor. Alert is what you called it. What does that mean?
Basically, I went through the instructor training for active shooters to train basically civilians. I went through it with probably 45 to 50 law enforcement personnel.
And have you written articles for various police magazines or university magazines?
Not recently, but in the distant past, yes.
And what do you do now?
Up until last August, I had both a private detective agency and a consulting firm. Basically, I closed down the private detective agency after about 31 years and primarily do consulting on police-related or police practices, mostly police-related litigation.
And were you retained to look at the investigation of the case that's now styled State of Florida versus Donald Wayne Hartung?
Yes, I was.
And are you being paid for your work?
I am. I'm being paid, appointed by the state and paid by them.
You're paid through the Judicial Administration Commission?
Hopefully, yes.
Okay. But that's who's, the state of Florida is going to pay you for your testimony today.
Correct.
And what is your hourly rate?
At the time I took this case on, it was $200 per hour and then $2,000 per day in trial testimony in court or deposition.
Now, for your review of the crime scene, you were provided with copies of the police reports, is that correct?
Yes.
And other discovery materials, including photographs and that sort of thing?
Correct.
Okay. Now, there was an issue with the trash can that was handled with various bits of evidence in it. Are you familiar with that black trash can?
From the laundry room, yes.
From the crime scene?
Yes.
Okay. It was, the testimony was it was transported to the evidence room where photographs were taken of it as it was emptied. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Would there have been a more efficient or a better way to have handled the gathering of the evidence contained in the trash can?
Certainly.
And can you explain to the jury how that should have been handled?
Rather than take a container, which is subject to shifting and movement and even being tipped over, the best approach would have been having a crime scene tech videotape it as you are actually removing each item, and then you can separate them and package them up, identify in what order. That would have been the absolute best way of dealing with that.
And would that have been done on the scene?
The best way, yes.
So you wouldn't have to move the trash can at all?
Anytime you move it, you could have a shifting of the objects inside it. So yes, to do it where it, or in very close proximity to where it was discovered.
Now, as far as the thermostats are concerned, how should that be handled to ensure that the temperature in the house was properly verified?
You're talking about the crime scene?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. The crime scene at the house.
It should have been recorded, particularly when the bodies were present. That would be significant, and as far as assisting the pathologist in determining or attempting to determine the time of death.
Now, there was a situation where Sergeant Bjornson left his DNA in the kitchen on a screw on a faucet. Are you familiar with that?
Correct. He was the supervisor
Yes.
of the crime
sir.
scene techs.
And what is the issue with that?
It was just completely outside protocol and reckless or careless. Anytime you go into a crime scene, you try not to contaminate it or introduce any foreign objects, such as the sergeant's DNA. Way you do that is fresh gloves, masks, booties. Sometimes you have full body suits, the paper suits and other types, so that when you were processing it, they call it Locard's exchange principle. I refer to it when I teach people about criminal investigation. It's the theory of transfer. Whenever you go into a location, you leave something behind and take something with you. If you're dealing with criminals who are at a crime scene, they leave something behind or they take something with them. The object is to link the two, and then you have evidence of the crime. So the people who are developing or gathering this want to do everything reasonable and possible to avoid contaminating the scene and leaving something there that that may change the ability to deal with that theory of transfer.
This was a situation where there were 3 bodies, which is an unusual situation.
For most jurisdictions, I'd say extremely unusual, correct.
And what would be the proper police procedure for ensuring that you don't miss or lose any evidence?
Well, you secure the scene, you limit who goes in and who goes out. You also, I mean, criminal investigation 101, you establish a crime scene log. Who was in there? because again, you go back to the theory of transfer. So you would want to know everybody who may have been there and what times they were there, or what this, I think, crime scene lasted for like 5 to 7 days. So you'd want to know when they were there and when they left. So if there was a problem, such as the sergeant leaving DNA evidence behind, you would be able to determine who may, who else may have contaminated the scene, if the scene was contaminated. So you want to know everybody. Were the EMS personnel in there? You log them in, you log them out. Fire department personnel who helped open it up, if they were different from the EMS. The people who removed the bodies. You need documentation for all of that. And that wasn't done in this case.
Why is it important to know when people leave?
Because if the scene was altered in any way, when it may have been altered or what they have done. You could go back and link what was their purpose for being there and make a determination about that.
In this particular case, at the conclusion of the investigation, 2 knives were found. One was in a chair and one was in a couch. What does that indicate to you with these knives not being found from a chair and a couch that were in the residence?
Well, you're talking after the crime scene was released, the chair was being removed from the home. After you have a bloody crime scene, they have different ways of cleaning it up. And oftentimes, if things are blood-soaked, you would remove them if they can't be utilized again in the future. And so I believe on August 11th, the chair was being removed and a bloody knife fell out from the cushion. On August 12th, they were removing a love seat, and these items were in close proximity to 2 of the bodies. Another knife fell out. Neither knife was recovered. Apparently, they were both inside the cushions, which would indicate to me that it wasn't a very thorough or a thorough search of the most obvious places for evidence.
Just a second. As far as there was testimony that a storage unit that belonged to one of the victims, Richard Thomas Smith, was found but not inventoried or searched. What is in proper police procedure? Should that have been inventoried and searched even though it was off-site?
Absolutely. I mean, it should have been documented, photos should have been taken, should have been searched, because you don't know who did what. There may have been evidentiary material in that off-site place that could take you in a whole new path on your investigation.
No. There was testimony that the homicide investigator in charge said he looked at some video of the people, he looked at video to see if anybody entered the storage unit after the fact, but that it was open. Apparently he looked in, decided there was nothing that he wanted to review and left it, didn't inventory it or search it. Is that still improper procedure?
If you have a whodunit situation, absolutely. Even if you have a theory, you should explore all potential avenues, because you don't know. If you develop additional information, it may lead you in a different direction. And the purpose of an investigation is to determine the truth about what happened. It's not to just look at evidence that supports your initial theory.
Now, we talked about the thermostats possibly being changed, possibly not being changed. Would you think that fingerprints should be taken on those thermostats to determine if anybody had changed the temperature from what it normally would have been in the house?
That could be an example of police or law enforcement personnel contaminating the scene. If you do that, if you change anything, it should be documented. But yeah, you can, I mean, if there was documentation that when the police entered, it was X degree, and now it's Y degree, and you could have an explanation for why. It was oppressively hot in there, you know, it was horrendous odors. We opened the doors, you know, we turned on the air as high as it could be. Now, obviously, you want to limit the amount of potential contamination of the scene to get critical evidence before you alter anything. But if law enforcement changed the thermostat to provide a better working environment, it should have been documented. And if it wasn't documented, then certainly if there's an indication that it might have been changed, that should have been processed for fingerprints and/or DNA.
Now, Mr. Hartung was a suspect and a firearm was used to shoot Richard Thomas Smith. And although the search of Mr. Hartung's home occurred 3 days after it is believed that the Smiths were murdered, would it still have been reasonable to take his shirts to check them for gunshot residue or GSR?
Possibly. You're looking for the presence of barium and antimony, two things that are in two chemicals. You know, it certainly wouldn't have hurt to make that attempt. Those things could be on clothing, they could be on an individual's hands, but as you wear, rub your hands, wash your hands, it gets removed. But that item on clothing, if you had discharged a firearm and it was in close proximity to your clothing that the shooter was wearing at that time, then there's a potential that could have possibly been detected.
And even though it was several days later, if the shirts had been washed, they would have lost the gunshot residue, correct?
Yes.
But if they hadn't been washed, it may still be there?
Correct.
Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is Investigator Enfinger, who was the lead homicide investigator on this case, indicated that at about 12:30 he arrived at the crime scene, and at 1:30 he, this is PM, he had Mr. Hartung in an interview room interviewing him, and he has testified that he determined by 1:30, within an hour of him arriving at the crime scene, Mr. Hartung was the person who committed the murders, and he did not have anyone else as a suspect, nor did he investigate anyone else. Do you see any issues with that?
It's very problematic. Once you make a preliminary opinion based on a hunch or an instinct, and you don't look at any other possibilities. For example, of the three victims, one was killed or at least attacked in a different manner. One had a position with Department of Homeland Security. Now, was he the target and these others a cover-up? We don't know. But once a detective develops a theory and only considers information which supports his or her theory, then you are either ignoring or refusing to accept other possibilities. So at least in the initial stages, okay, you could like him as a potential suspect, but to exclude all other considerations at that point is the antithesis of a sound, objective criminal investigation. The purpose of the investigation is to determine the truth of what happened, not what this detective thinks may have happened, particularly before the whole scene's processed and you gather all the information.
Although, as many police officers do, there is a hunch as to who may have done this or a belief that someone may have done it, do you still need to attempt to gather information to eliminate any other people?
Absolutely. Otherwise, you fall into that trap. And, there's a potential that you have the wrong person. And because that detective liked it, that person is a suspect, that's all he did, or that's all he caused to do, was to focus on that individual and not consider other possibilities.
Would that be gathering evidence to support your theory?
That's the problem when you do that, correct. You only gather or consider the evidence that supports your theory and ignore anything that may dispute it or isn't consistent with it.
Is determining who the murderer is within an hour of arriving on the crime scene without the benefit of having the crime scene fully processed bad police work?
In my opinion, yes. I mean, if you have a guy there and he's got a knife in one hand and a gun in the other and he's saying, I did it, okay, then you could consider him as your primary suspect. But until you get additional information and you explore everything that the scene has to offer and collect all the information you possibly can, how could you even possibly consider that? I mean, you can think he's a possible suspect, but to start at that point and eliminate all others, I'm sorry, that's not how detectives are trained. It's not how they're taught, and it's an antithesis of good investigative work.
I don't have anything further. Mr. Myers?
Good afternoon, Mr. Waller.
Good afternoon.
Looking through your CV, most of your, I guess, police work was more administrative kind of later in your career?
That's a mix of, I mean, I've served in a variety of capacities. Toward the end of my career, yes, I was police chief.
Right, and that was 1987?
That's when I left Ripon, correct. And then I was an interim chief in 1989 for the campus police for about 5 or 6 months.
When you were talking about you did some work in Miami as a police officer?
Yes, sir.
When was that?
71 through 76.
When you were working in Miami as a police officer on the street, and I'm saying that like on the street, doing the actual day in and day out work, did you process crime scenes?
Yes.
Okay, what types of crime scenes?
Well, we pretty much did. I was a detective and then a detective sergeant with the South Miami Police Department. We processed all the general crimes, larcenies, auto theft, burglaries, that sort of thing. If we were working a homicide or a sexual assault, we brought in the county's crime scene units.
Okay, so you didn't process any homicide scenes?
I investigated homicides. I brought in the county homicide units, usually multiple units, to process that. It was a more...
Yes, sir. My question was, did you actually do the processing of a
No.
homicide? No. Did you process a triple homicide in a hoarder's house?
No.
Now, you indicated that you are being paid by the state of Florida, but you were hired by defense, weren't you?
He is the attorney. Mr. Griffith is the one that contacted me, and my understanding is I was appointed by the court, yes.
And you're being paid $200 an hour?
Hopefully.
And how many hours have you put in?
Initially, less than 20, and that was before the first trial was pushed back, or pushed till now, and probably another 12,
So about 32 hours total, plus your,
roughly.
plus your testimony.
Yes.
Now, you indicated that, and my last question about, when was the last time you testified in Florida in a criminal case?
Probably, well, 1977, I believe, they brought me back for a case in Miami, a robbery trial.
So, do you know when DNA was first used by law enforcement?
Yes.
When was that?
It,
When was that?
initially, it was in the early 90s, and then as it became more refined and developed, it was used more frequently. And as the testing process proliferated and you had more labs doing it, and it became less expensive, you had more and more use of it.
And you indicated earlier that you had two jobs. One is on a consultant firm and the other is a private detective firm that's now closed.
Well, they were combined. I did both things.
Okay. And you've been doing that consulting firm for how long?
I opened my own shop in 1992, I believe.
It's at about 28 years?
Yes, sir. I started the consulting, my very first case was in 1988, so, in that.
All right. You indicated the trash can should have been processed on scene.
I said that would have been the best to ensure you could have somebody videotape it, and as you remove each item, and account for any shifting and the layering and that sort of thing. That would have been the absolute best.
Is it not best to process evidence, especially DNA evidence, in a sterile environment?
Well, you have to remove it at some point, and obviously if it's in a garbage can, it's not in a sterile environment. So you do the best you can, and the very best option would have been video and do it on site and document each item as it's being removed.
If a crime scene tech has on the latex gloves and turns down the thermostat, they're not going to leave a fingerprint. Is that accurate?
Assuming they're wearing gloves, it would not leave a fingerprint and probably not leave DNA.
And if you indicated that it should be recorded when they enter, have you seen the photographs in the case?
I have.
Okay. Did you see a photograph of the thermostat?
I did.
So it's documented.
No, I didn't see when it was taken or by whom and what time, what day. They were there for 5 to 7 days. So I would want to know what it was like when they first went in and a documentation of that.
And you indicated that they should have kept a crime scene log, correct?
That's standard procedure.
Okay. Did you see a crime scene log in this case?
No, I did not. I saw references in different parts of the reports about who may have been there. Some people were excluded, some people were included. but it didn't list the times they were at the scene and didn't leave when they arrived and when they left.
You knew that ECSO was out there? Escambia County Sheriff's Office, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Florida Department of Law Enforcement,
yes,
Department of Homeland Security,
yes,
Medical Examiner's Office,
yes.
State Attorney's Office,
An investigator, yes,
EMS,
yes,
body removal,
yes,
and you were able to note that they had all entered the scene, right?
I was aware that they had, yes, didn't know when and didn't know their names, which is something that you would want in an investigation.
Were you provided the CAD reports in this case?
I don't recall.
Can you tell the jury what a CAD report is?
Usually it's a printout, computer-aided dispatch, so it's documentation that the dispatchers provide to law enforcement in the field.
And does that include the date and time that they go out on the calls?
It may or may not, and it may not include all personnel. But it's not a substitute for a crime scene log.
Gunshot residue, it can be found on your hand, on clothes, or on anything that's within a close proximity of a fired gun. Is that accurate?
Yes, usually within like a foot and a half or so.
Right. It can be found on somebody who did not fire the gun.
You may have some of that, like an agriculture worker may have those traces if they've been handling fertilizer, yes.
If we were in a close proximity and I fire a gun, could it get on you?
Yes,
You kind of indicated it with Mr. Griffith, but gunshot residue can go away. It can be washed off, rubbed off, correct?
yes.
Okay, and so the timing of when you collect that is important, is it not?
And depends on what occurred in between.
In cases where family members are killed, is it not common that a family member is a suspect?
It's not uncommon, yes.
And with Mr. Hartung being on scene there on the 31st, wouldn't you agree that he should have been interviewed?
Oh, absolutely.
You're aware that Mr. Hartung was not arrested for 3 months?
Yes. I mean, approximately, I'd have to look up the specific dates, but I knew it was an extended time period.
Mr. Waller, have you ever made a mistake?
Sure.
Did you write a report in this case?
No,
Why not?
was not asked to.
Thank you. You read that?
Yes, sir. Although it's been a while since you've testified in state court in Florida, you've testified in other courts throughout the United States, haven't you, since then?
Oh, sure, I testified last Thursday in southern Indiana.
Do you also testify in federal court?
Yes, sir. Wednesday in Chicago, I will be testifying in federal court.
Now, on CAD reports, which is what Mr. Myers referred you to, in a CAD report, that wouldn't necessarily indicate when the Department of Homeland Security investigators entered and left the residence, would it?
Not unless somebody reported investigator so-and-so or agent so-and-so from Homeland Security is here, they've entered the scene, and then acknowledged that when they left it, and then the dispatcher recorded it. But that generally does not happen.
You didn't see any indication of that in any of the discovery materials you were provided?
No, sir.
And the CAD reports don't necessarily say when any of the medical examiners people go in and out?
Correct.
They may keep their own log, but that doesn't go into a master log, does it?
No.
Now, as Mr. Myers said, family members are usually suspects, but that doesn't make them the only suspect, does it?
Correct.
And you still need to develop other suspects, even if you have family members, isn't that right?
Right. I mean, you don't want to close your mind or narrow your outlook right at the start. You want to keep it broad-based, and as you develop information, an individual suspect or suspects may develop, but that's what you're supposed to do. That's what you're trained to do.
And just because you have a family member, that doesn't mean they're guilty.
Correct.
I don't have anything further.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Counsel, please. All right, members of the jury, that wraps up our proceedings for today. We will meet again tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and the defense is expected to finish their case by early afternoon. So again, with our thanks and appreciation, their release, I'll remind you again not to come in contact with any information dealing with this case. Hope you have a good evening.